In this speech, I'm going to explain why the affirmative team gets more positive industrial action and why we strengthen union membership. But first, 4 pieces of setup. First, why will this be done well? We tell you it's really simple, because there are huge incentives for unions to do this strategically. There are disincentives from striking. Note here, these are pretty inconvenient, right? You don't get paid. There is a level of negative consequences. We tell you as a result, unions have enormous incentives to do this strategically. So follow-up question. Second, what does strategically look like? We tell you there are 3 main examples of strategic solidarity strikes. First, striking in different parts of the supply chain of a particular company. That we tell you that this looks like things like, for example, if Woolworths retail workers are striking, truck drivers might also strike in solidarity in order to enhance the effectiveness of that strike. Second, per the info slide, we tell you that striking in the same industry. We know here this is, so for example, if Amazon casual drivers are striking, Uber drivers might also, we tell you that why this is particularly important in increasingly casualized workforces where it is very easy to replace people, right? So for example, again, Amazon drivers are striking, Uber drivers might also strike. Third, we tell you that striking in solidarity, because the protections that particular union is trying to win will also benefit you. Again, very similarly, it's Amazon workers striking when Uber workers are trying to gain certain protections, etc. Okay, third then in setup, what is the status quo for unions? 2 things under this. First, we tell you that there have been so many union busting efforts. We tell you these have been very successful, and as a result, unions are often fairly specialized, right? That's to say that most unions that have developed recently are often very company specific. So it's like developing an Amazon union or an Uber union. These are very small, they're very specific, they're very localized, they're often company based. Second, we tell you that some unions in particular sectors are often quite weak. That's not true of all unions. Some unions are capable of advocating meaningful change, but some are particularly weak. For example, gig economy unions belong to gig economy. We tell you that it's teaching unions, etc. Fourth, finally, very quickly, why are solidarity strikes currently illegal? There is no good answer. The answer is it's illegal because union busting has been really effective, because corporations have huge amounts of power, and because they've been able to stop workers from advocating for themselves in effective ways. Right. Given this then, why do we get more positive industrial action? That's the first claim we're going to make. Subclaim, first one, why does this improve on the status quo? Right? 4 reasons under this. First, we tell you this diminishes your capacity to find a replacement workforce. Right? That's to say, the main way that corporations deal with strikes, the main way that corporations are unaffected by them is through scouts, right? They get people to go and they get an alternative workforce to go and do the work. We tell you this makes this harder in 2 different ways. First, the workers who could do it are also striking, right? So Amazon doesn't just go and hire a bunch of Uber drivers who are casualized because those Uber drivers are also striking. But second, it also makes it really hard to replace because you have to replace more people. Because now, going back to that Woolworths example, you don't just have to replace Woolworths retail workers, you now also have to replace truck drivers. That means strikes become much more effective. It's much harder for businesses to find a replacement workforce. Second, we tell you this increases public support, right? That's to say, strikes sometimes fail because they just lose a level of public support. The public becomes pretty dissatisfied. We tell you that if a bunch of unions agree that something is bad and they all strike and they're all very public about striking, this just lends a level of legitimacy to the perspectives of unions, right? We tell you that unions are often able to amass power and influence to influence the media, right? We tell you also that if a number of unions are striking, this just increases the proportional amount of knowing someone who is striking. That's probably pretty impactful. We tell you that as a result, we're probably going to be able to gain a level of public. We tell you that it's likely to increase public support. We also tell you that solidarity strikes just come across as very noble, right? Like you're striking, you're fighting for your rights in solidarity with other workers. This is a very noble thing. It sounds fairly good. We think this is fairly good publicity, and we think that probably, again, helps to strengthen workers' cases. Third, we tell you it allows big unions to help smaller unions, right? Because in an instance where there is a weak union, they are able to appeal to help from a stronger union, right? Note here that these will often be related, but not always. Even if it's not though, even if these aren't necessarily directly related, so they're not necessarily part of the same supply chain or part of the same company, they are still really useful. There's 2 reasons why this is still useful, even if they're in completely unrelated fields, or fairly unrelated fields. First, The signaling effect, right? There's a signal to other industries by saying workers will strike if you do this. If you try and take away our leave rights, if you try and decrease our overtime pay, we will strike. That's probably pretty useful. And secondly, it just increases pressure on the government to do something. So even if workers are striking in unrelated fields, this tends to increase pressure on the government to intervene and to take action. I think that's probably good. And we think that when workers are striking fairly widely, this probably increases pressure on the government to act in favour of the unions. Fourth, very importantly, solidarity strikes can happen globally. That means you can strike. That means workers in countries with good protections for unions can strike to help people in countries where there are not good protections for unions. That is very good, right? If you're going to strike in a country with really strong union protections, you can do an enormous amount, just like really an enormous amount to help people in very disadvantaged developing countries who might not have access to those kinds of things, who might not have access to that. What we tell you at the end of this, then, in fact, what we tell you at the end of this is first, you just expedite rights. Note you just expedite the process of getting protections for workers. Note this is very important, right? The current industrial action system, almost everywhere on the planet, is incredibly biased in favor of businesses. It is incredibly biased in favor of corporations. It is very, like, the ability for workers to strike is fairly limited. We tell you that all of the benefits they get in terms of being able to be paid more overtime, being able to be paid more for overtime, getting paid full stop, getting safer conditions, getting leave, getting healthcare are super important. We know here that exclusive to our side in particular is the ability for workers in developing countries to lean on workers with countries below workers' protections, to be able to lean on countries with better workers' rights protections. That's something exclusive to our side. But second, we also tell you that strikes just get better. That's to say that strikes are not fun, right? We put up with them because they are an essential part of protecting workers' rights, but that right now status quo is often death by 1,000 cuts, right? When workers strike all at once, you're able to have much more impactful strikes, but they're also but also because they're short, they're sweet, you get the change you want, it's far less painful for everyone involved, right? Like instead of having like a strike every couple of months with the New South Wales transport system, you would have just one strike where a bunch of industry, where a bunch of related workers go on strike, where a bunch of people across the New South Wales public sector walk out, and then you just get those workers get better rights, and everything goes back to normal. That's probably much more convenient. It's probably a lot better. Second, then, very quickly, why we strengthen union membership. First, we tell you that if strikes are more effective, more people think unions work for them. This is fairly intuitive, right? If people strike, and they strike widely, and these strikes work, we tell you that people are just going to be more incentivized to join their union, they're going to be more incentivized to participate in their union, they're going to believe in this more as a valuable mechanism. Second, then, we also tell you that big unions have an incentive to strike in solidarity with and build up smaller unions. That's because it's very useful for there to be a reciprocal relationship. That reciprocity is contingent on small unions being able to do those things. So large unions have an incentive to do things like dedicate resources to building up small unions. Again, note those small unions are the most vulnerable people because they're the people who are currently least able to advocate for their current workers' protections. And what this leads to is an enormous benefit to people in smaller unions. So in the end of this, you should believe. So we tell you also, third, these impacts are cyclical, right? So the more that we increase union membership, the easier it is to get positive action in favour of workers' rights. That's a good thing. At the end of the speech, you should believe that under the affirmative team, we get better outcomes for workers, get better outcomes for workers across the world, we get better strikes that are more effective, but also less cyclically painful, and we get better, stronger union membership. Very proud to affirm.
Did people want me to continue clapping? I wasn't sure if the...
No, it's great,
okay,
thank
cool.
you. I forgot to start this at the start.
I was like, oh, no one's clapped yet, maybe I should do it.
Thanks very much for that. I thank First Affirmative and welcome First Negative.
First thing that's set up is just to note that the issue that these strikers are asking for from these other entities must be extremely serious if they have to go through all this logistical effort of coordinating with other unions and going on this huge amount. Like, they probably would have exhausted other options, as in they've done individual strikes and stuff, we should suggest to you that the concessions that these workers are trying to get are just relatively serious. But secondly, their claim or their context of this debate is like, this is about strikes against Amazon. But I think that's just obviously not the case. Like, for their reasons that they identify, the power that these unions have over mega corporations is just extraordinarily small. They suggest that it's because they're nascent and they're specialized. But it's for the reason that they have the extremely low skill. Uber driver is an extremely replaceable job. So it's not really clear that these unions have any power. We explain that Amazon, a multi-billion-dollar company, can probably weather the storm of a few truck drivers not doing their job for a few weeks. Obviously, this debate isn't about against corporations. We explain that this debate is about the public sector, and that's where the greatest degree of change is. That's where strikes are the most efficacious or do a lot of damage to the government and get the most bargaining power. This debate is just about the public sector. First argument is about why these strikes are super bad, and you should all, I guess these strikes specifically are just extremely bad. We explain that these are extremely critical and time-sensitive industries. That looks like nurses and doctors, that looks like transport workers, that looks like the teachers. These are, and notably, governments can't break these picket lines. These strikes are legal, which means that governments cannot replace these workers in those critical time periods. What are the issues then that these strikes or these workers are typically asking for? We explain that they have to be extremely generalized issues that all of these workers can agree upon, otherwise there's no incentive for you as a unrelated worker to stick your neck out for these people and cop a loss of pay. So these issues are probably just things like asking for more money, asking for better conditions, asking for better sick leave, and those sorts of things. We explain that governments just do lack the capacity to fold to these demands specifically. And we would explain that, again, these people are asking for an extraordinarily large amount of money, because if it was a reasonable amount of money, they would have done it by themselves. There was no need to mount this huge coordinated effort. So if it is a huge amount of money, we explain that this probably comes out of the government budget, which they are very reluctant to do, because these governments have planned out long-term budgetary interests. They've structured out how they're going to spend the money over the course of their electoral cycle, which means that when these actors demand extremely high amounts of short-term government expenditure, they obviously lack the capacity to do that because they've already invested into long-term projects and other expenditures that they've catered for and accounted for in their budget. But secondly, governments just do lack the incentive to do this. Two reasons why. The first is just that there's huge electoral pressure to not fold to these unions, because it just looks really weak. It looks like you are not running the policy, but those unions are running those policies. And we explain that this happens, in the context where this is needed the most, where unions on these workers just do need the best conditions, those are typically the fact that they have bad conditions in the first place is probably indicative of these unions being relatively weak. It also just looks like those governments being already anti-union in extremely conservative countries. But notably, we explain that this money comes out of other things as well. For instance, for an average voter, if that money is spent on more beds or building a new hospital wing or giving them more money through Social Security, those are benefits that directly affect the individual voter. Whereas, if you spend that money on paying your teachers well, there's still the same net amount of teachers. Or if you spend that money on paying those nurses well, there's still the same amount of teachers. So, for the public, for every dollar that you spend on raising these people's wages, that is a very unjustifiable cost as opposed to other measures that the government can spend that money on, which just demonstrates to you that they really lack the incentive to, I guess, cater to these unions. But the second reason why these governments have no incentive to fold to these unions is just because it legitimizes these unions as being an effective and legitimate form of protest, and this incentivizes even further strikes. So, what is the impact of this then? We explain that this just stalls the country in very meaningful ways. That necessarily, stalls the country in meaningful ways. That looks like, as I pointed out before, these unions are extraordinarily time sensitive. So that looks like people dying on the ER table or not getting to work. And then claims like, well, you would strike across industries. That just explains to you that I guess that effect magnifies. But we'd also just explain that when there are critical issues, a lot of these industries depend on one another, and to the extent that multiple industries are collectively striking, that makes those issues worse. For instance, you require the police to control those masses when there is an accident, but you also require ambos to transfer people from that accident to the hospital, but you also need doctors to treat those people once they reach the hospital. And that just explains to you that it's not just, it's far worse when multiple industries are striking at the same time, as opposed to just one of them, because it affects, as they claim, every part in that supply chain. That is very concrete harm that affects people directly. This is also far more impactful than Amazon losing a few workers. This is that's just important. Second part of the speech is to explain why this I guess union action would just not be effective and hurts unions into the long run. Their claim is like, well, this allows Uber drivers to collectivize and bargain and bargain between each other. And their explanation about why this works as industrial action is because it prevents your ability to replace those workers. But the problem with this analysis is that this is contingent on other people in those areas also being in unions as well. And we'd explain that right now at the moment, union participation just is on the decrease. The costs to join those unions are just exorbitant. But the benefits of joining that union is also speculative. You're speculative on whether that union is able to get you those changes that you want through strikes. But also it is just speculative whether you need the legal aid that union can provide you into the future. So union participation is just far down. But we also just explained that if there is a huge amount of people that are bound to strikes, then you as an individual Uber driver have a competitive advantage by not being in the union. So their mechanism of collective and solidarity action only applies to people who are in unions. We give you, I guess, the prisoner's dilemma of people want to not be in unions in order to break that collective action, which just defeats their mechanism for change on their side. So why is this bad for unions then? We explained that governments can just hold out and weather this storm, and I guess Amazon can also weather this storm. But for government specifically, we explained that the public is already on their side, right? Like the public has voted for them, so they obviously trust in that government's power to, I guess, govern that country. So the only point that this side affirmative team can change, can prove any sort of change, is if voters blame that government and replace that government into the future for not cooperating with that strike. Why do they not do that? A few reasons why. First is that government's people just do have a status quo bias. And we explain, like if in the natural order and like, you know, you're living your daily life and suddenly the train isn't working, the actor that is making that change isn't the government, the actor that is causing that change just is the union. Which means that when people attribute blame to those actors, they're not attributing it to the government because the government has been doing that action all the time. So the person who is making that change is the union, which means that for the average person, they are just going to blame the person who is breaking from the status quo and disrupting their disrupting their daily life. But secondly, we'd also just explain that governments have more influence and have a greater capacity to weaponize the media and have the greater capacity to get that message out there, which means that in terms of like there is a huge asymmetry in the government versus the union's ability to proliferate these messages. But thirdly, we explain that governments can also just weaponize leverage these unions against one another. For instance, that looks like negotiating with one of those unions specifically as opposed to the rest of them, necessarily breaking up that solidarity action. But notably, unions aren't monolithic. Different parts of that union require different amounts of pay and have different needs. So for instance, in that Amazon example, maybe those Uber drivers don't have a lot of upkeep costs of their industry, but maybe those truck drivers do because they took out a loan for that truck and they need to pay that off. We just explained that governments can play off those differential needs. Maybe some people in that union actually need a lot of money, whereas some people in that union need that money now. That is the difference between these unions that they cannot reconcile. That is a difference that governments can exploit to break them up. But we explained that people are suffering to a greater degree than the government would be because of these strikes. Because they need that money. They feel guilty that they're not helping the patients that they said they would. We explained that the government only suffers in 2 years when that election happens, but these people are suffering now. That's a much more direct short-term harm. To the extent that people fold, obviously these union workers have a direct incentive to fold, have a far greater, or they're far more likely to fold in the short term. So they don't help those union workers. Amazon was never going to pay their union workers and their bus drivers. Obviously, you should believe that this is bad. So yeah.
Thank you both for that speech, and welcome second back.
Side negative says unions are ineffective, and you can never possibly hope to take on the multinational conglomerate that is Amazon, or that is another one of these giant companies. And that is the exact problem that side affirmative points to, is that an individual union, without any solidarity from anyone else within Amazon, without solidarity from the Amazon drivers, without solidarity from the Amazon workers in the office, without solidarity from the Amazon workers in the factory, who notably are all separate workforces joining in to celebrate, to strike, and to protest, that is the point at which you empower allow these unions to have actual influence, I'm highly confused as to the strategy of the side negative team to limit this debate to the public sector, because I think these mechanisms carry over. I would suggest that all government workers operating in different sectors, operating with different mechanisms, striking together, have far more influence than they can possibly have under side negative's world. So clearly, this debate is about the private sector and the public sector. Both are equally impactful. It is foolish of this side negative team to try and cut them out of the debate. I'm firstly going to deal with their claims about how you can't afford or you don't have an incentive as the government, if it is about the government, in order to change as well the unions. They're going to deal with their claims about chaos. Firstly, on their claims about, there are two claims on why this is kind of factually not going to work. The first thing they say is the government can't afford to do anything or increase wages. The second thing they say is that the government has no incentive because if they capitulate to these workers, they will look weak. Firstly, this is factually untrue. Governments have very deep pockets and they are highly willing to increase wages in particular circumstances. The Labour government just did an entire campaign, an entire last election on upping the minimum wage, then upped the minimum wage. They clearly have it in its capacity to do this. The second thing that I will point to here is that obviously the comparative is worse. You look far worse if you're knocking back workers who are wanting basic rights, and Side Negative does this analysis for us, because they explain that the things you're looking for are like chill, fine, cool things. You want a couple of extra rights, like minimum hours of work days, minimum pay rates. Those are things that are incredibly empathetic causes that a government looks actually evil if you knock back a bunch of construction workers when they say we want hard hats on our work sites. Obviously those are causes that you look far, far worse electorally if you knock back. But secondly, we will point out that a lot of these matters are not financially contingent. So things like minimum work hours and things like that do not require any investment. It is just a regulation, so that is mitigation at its absolute best. But finally, workers, and particularly these workers, are your voters and often your most vocal and vulnerable voters, because they speak out when these things aren't changed. They speak out when their rights aren't given to them. They have the most to gain and lose in these elections. People who have incredibly high-paying jobs generally don't have as much to gain or to lose because they can fall back on their deep pockets. These are the workers who speak the loudest. These are the workers who make the greatest changes. That analysis fails. The second claim that they then make is it's going to cause a whole bunch of chaos, and that is really bad. I would point out, even if this is true, taking them at their absolute best, this is short-term chaos that we are willing to trade off. This is the case for 4 reasons. The first of which is this is the exact reason as to why strikes fail now. They don't pack enough punch. The government can just kind of push them away and say this isn't going to happen, don't worry about it. Exactly what's happening with the public transport strikes right now. Secondly, strikes only exist to solve the issue. The continuation of the strike should imply to you that the issue isn't solved. If you solve the issue with a bigger strike, you are able to address the strikes and therefore no longer let the strikes happen. But secondly, companies knock back these strikes in the status quo because your workers, particularly in the private sector, are a series of things that we point out as Sofia. They are replaceable, they're often low skilled, or they are gig economy workers, or they are casualized, so they don't have lock-in contracts where you can literally fire them at any point. These series of lack of protections mean you need a broader set of protections from other union workers who do have these protections, who bargain for these protections for you, who joins in solidarity with your strikes. But finally, if you solve these issues, there's no need for strikes. The second claim that we make then is we make these strikes better, because we point out that unions want to attract other groups, attract other workforces to their strikes, which explains that they try and palatably and organize their strikes in as convenient a way as possible in order to get as many people involved. They won't say crazy shit or opt to crazy shit, because that means you're not going to get workers going in solidarity with you. You need to opt for a common cause. There should be an underlying fighting factor that you're going for there. But thirdly, they point out, we point out, that strikes are still regulated to some extent on our side, as they are in the status quo. You now just can join in solidarity, so you can't cause chaos and riots in strikes on the streets. But their best claim says that, well, hospital workers can now strike, and that's really bad because you need people to work in hospitals. But I would suggest that these are going to be the most effective form of strike that exists, because you create a buzz in the public when you do not have enough nurses in order to cure your patients, when you do not have enough doctors and surgeons to cure diseases and injuries, which means these are the most effective people to be opting into the strikes. This gets the most immediate change that we're absolutely willing to trade off in the short term. Their final claim is this is going to foster a whole bunch of hate for unions and result in union turnout decreasing. We have a series of responses to this. Firstly, we point out that the vast majority of people are incredibly empathetic to the cause that unions are fighting for. This is for three reasons. The first of which is often these causes are very similar, so workers across industries kind of all want the same thing. You want minimum working hours, you want rights and protections, you want extra awards if you're working in unsafe conditions. But secondly, these workers are perceived as an incredibly vulnerable class going going up to big MNCs or the conglomerate that is the government and saying, we would like some extra money, please, sir. Like, these are people who are incredibly easy to empathize with. But finally, causing for strikes are generally quite good. Oh, I guess that's the same there. I've wrote it twice. My bad. Cool. Okay. At the end of this, what should you believe? You should firstly believe that unions are bolstered and stronger because they just have more people involved. You should secondly believe that the messaging of unions is one that is more public and palatable. And finally, you should believe that the kinds of chaos that they are talking about, in our absolute worst case, if you believe no other analysis, is purely short-term, which you are unquestionably willing to trade off in order to get these increases of rights that we see at the moment. Obviously, these are rights that we desperately need. These are rights that society demands. These are rights that these workers want. The expediency of these rights is incredibly important. And the lack of these rights being given to these people, with these strikes continuously failing, indicates a desperate need for a change. Side negative then might make two additional claims. I'm going to preemptively rebut them both. The first thing they might suggest is that union busting is going to get a lot worse. I have two responses to this. Firstly, the unions that are bustable have already been busted in the status quo. And that is just to say that unions have been knocked into the ground completely currently because you have a maximal incentive to do this as a government. And secondly, we point out that strong unions like the stevedores union and the CFMEU, are often like massive unions that are incredibly important for those particular industries, and you're coerced to join them if you're a member of those industries. And often they're like conditions of contracts that you have to join the union. And they exist because they're incredibly strong. If you make a whole bunch of unions opt into their model, that's an incredibly good benefit there. But secondly, we would suggest that bigger unions now have an interest to build up smaller unions and make them better, which it tries to counteract a lot of this union busting, which is just to say, if you have a larger union and you want people to join in solidarity with you, you need these unions to exist in order for them to join in solidarity with you. So you try and build up those unions, and you have expertise in doing so because you are a good and successful union that has survived the union bust. One of the greatest campaigns of the capitalistic society is to bust the fuck out of these unions. These are the fellas that have survived. They know what they're doing. They're obviously going to be very good at this. So clearly a union busting way is not the way they can win this debate. The final way that they might try and win this debate is to say that businesses have rights too, guys, and we need to protect these businesses' rights to fire people. I have a series of responses to this. One, don't care. Your businesses, you have money. Number two, we have employer associations that exist exclusively for this purpose. And that is just to say that these employer associations have the same thing for a union but for employers, which means that we try to level the playing field by giving people who are the most vulnerable in comparison to incredibly deep-pocketed unions an association to fight the employer associations. That is incredibly big benefit there. But finally, we would suggest that businesses can lobby the government in other ways because they have incredibly deep pockets. It's not clear that they need this power, that people clearly need this power because they're not getting the rights that they so desperately deserve. If you believe in workers and you hate the government, vote side affirmative.
Thanks, second affirmative, for that speech, and welcome second negative.
I don't care how much you buy affirmative material, because even if every single thing that they say stands, the impacts of the public sector engaging in solidarity strikes is incredibly harmful. You see things like, doctors and policemen, you see doctors and policemen striking at the same time, leading to massive public unrest. You see things like EMTs no longer going to work to replace the doctors that may be able to provide essential health services. Those are insanely large impacts that you should infinitely care about more than anything, any benefit that they can give you in the private sector, even though it kind of just doesn't even matter anyway. A couple things in the speech. Firstly, just generally about the stuff about the public sector and why it's so incredibly harmful, and why, even if they try to engage in this and explain to you why the public sector gets better help, that we don't really care about it. Second thing in the speech is to explain why these strikes for the private sector aren't particularly effective. And then finally, the impact on unions. Firstly then, on stuff about the public sector, because note that the comparative here is that the effectiveness of these strikes within the public sector doesn't really change across both sides. Why is this? Because note that the public sector is often things like essential services, right? Striking alone is often quite effective because it's seen as a large public threat. People lose out on surgeries, firefighters are unhelpful. But what this actually means here, it means that there aren't that many extra government concessions within solidarity strikes for the public sector. What the actual change in this debate is then within the public sector isn't about whether or not these doctors, these nurses, these firefighters get more pay. It's about how it impacts the public. Because note here that the public sector often has very similar interests in terms of the strikes, in terms of what they want to get out of the strikes, and that means that they're likely to engage in these strikes together, like they explained to you at first affirmative. This means that you see multiple groups from the public sector striking at the same time. The disruption is incredibly insane. If you see like policemen and firefighters striking at the same time, that's fucking insane, because now you don't have people who are able to you don't see people that are able to help people out of fires in these really time urgent scenarios. You don't see people who are able to arrest or like quell like violent conflicts. That means that the change here is incredibly massive, because these are people who may be losing their lives under their side. These are people who don't get the help that they actually need. These are multiple groups, multiple essential groups losing the public losing multiple essential groups at the same time. That's an incredibly large harm. Let's talk about how this impacts the private sector then, because I'm going to be incredibly charitable and engage on their tiny impacts. The first thing that they tell you here is that you can't replace workers, and that means that they have a lot of bargaining power. And I think that just within these corporations, it's pretty fucking ridiculous to say that they can't replace them. Two reasons. Firstly, note that these are low skilled jobs. Like they explained to you, Amazon truck drivers and Uber drivers. Those are incredibly easy to replace because often you just need a fucking driver's license. But the second thing to explain here is that often a lot of people in these lower skilled jobs within these large conglomerates are often unwilling to strike in the first place, because often these are some of their only sources of pay, and they are already incredibly low pay. It means that they need to prove why there is an incentive for them to all strike at the same time, to the point where these corporations lose out on their workers, to the point where these corporations are actually willing to make these concessions. But the next thing to explain here is the thing about public support, because I think they're really unrealistic here in trying to say that people really love unions and really love strikes, because obviously in their world, and if we engage on their material on the private sector, it just inconveniences everyone. Like someone's unable to take an Uber to work in the morning, someone's unable to get their Amazon package delivered in time. Those are inconveniences that often pile up and make people dislike these unions. And that means that regardless of whether or not people think it's a noble cause to strike for your rights, whether or not people think that you need to be paid a bit more, people are often quite self-serving and just want their lives to not often be inconvenienced, which means that the change on their side in terms of the public sector, the private sector, is incredibly small. You shouldn't buy that context in the debate. But the final thing to explain here is about the unions within the public sector, because they're incredibly important. The first thing to explain here is that, again, public support just gets actively worse. Obviously, if you're losing your doctors, people aren't going to be like, yippee, go get your pay, queens. Like, obviously, you're actively disrupting a lot of people and disrupting their capacity to access essential services. But the second thing to explain here is we think that stronger unions is just incredibly unrealistic, because obviously that's contingent on there being concessions in the first place. Firstly, note that I explained to you that concessions are likely to be symmetric within the public sector, because I think the bargaining power is relatively similar. That it's the only difference in this debate is the manifestation of these strikes. So that means that the trust in unions don't have that much of a change, and that means that often these small unions are also unable to grow because people don't actually buy into the effectiveness of the unions. But the final thing under here is that they say that big unions can help other small unions, and that means that these small unions can grow and unions become a lot better. And I think that's just really unrealistic and doesn't engage with anything that Ollie tells you. We can tell you that even if we engage in their context of these unions in the private sector, there is an incentive to just try and separate these larger unions from these smaller ones to prevent them from growing and preventing them from having a lot of power. This looks like potentially appeasing these larger unions to prevent them from wanting to help the smaller unions because they're already okay with what they have. This looks like the government potentially trying to support the larger unions in order to make sure that smaller unions from smaller, more sectors that are treated worse don't gain that much bargaining power in the future, so they don't have to pay people more. I think that's incredibly important. What that means here is that unions just are less legitimate on their side. Unions have less power on their side, and the impact here is threefold. Firstly, there's this huge union resentment, right? Because even if the government does concede to these unions and gives them what they want, it just looks really bad. Because don't listen to what they say about how the governments have really thickly lined pockets. That's fucking ridiculous. Loads of governments are in debt right now. It means that it just looks really harmful, and you have to take money out of other sectors in order to often appease a lot of these unions. But the second thing to explain for you is that it does just hurt smaller unions. Because even in their best case, maybe the smaller unions get one small benefit from one solidarity strike. But afterwards, no one wants to help them anymore. These smaller unions lose their legitimacy. That's incredibly harmful. But at the end of the speech, I just want to weigh up the two worlds that we explained to you on three main metrics. Firstly, on severity, because on their side, regardless of which context we debate in, the public or the private, the change for workers is incredibly minimal. Corporations these workers under these massive corporations don't have the same bargaining power, even if they engage in solidarity strikes. Or, like I explained to you, in the public sector, they actually in the public sector, the incentive to make concessions is really unclear. There isn't that much of a change, but the impact on people is massive, because obviously in the public sector, when you see multiple of these public services striking at the same time, that's incredibly harmful. People lose their lives. But the second thing under here is that the government just loses loads of money even if they make these concessions, which again is incredibly harmful because the government is low on money. But the second thing to explain here is uncertainty, because with big corporations or with these public sectors, you never know if change actually happens. I think it's an incredibly speculative benefit that they have. But the definite thing here is people do just definitely lose out on these public services, and even if we engage in their world, it is just small inconveniences for people that are incredibly certain. But the final thing to explain here is that strikes don't just get solved on their side. This is an incredibly long-term issue. Firstly, the concessions are never going to be incredibly major once off. It's going to be small concessions because the government is incredibly limited on money. It means that these strikes will continue to happen. People continue to lose their lives. This is an incredibly large harm. So I think they need to actually engage with the important context of this debate.
I find it just so bizarre that Affirmative makes their case about some of the least unionized workforces in the world. Under 10% of all Amazon workers across all the supply chains this team tells you are unionized. So if their claim is that you're gonna get global strikes from Africa to America to Australia of Amazon employees, it's not an impact because too few of those workers are actually unionized to have any impact. This team does no proof across readers to explain why low-skilled, easily replaceable workers across entire global supply chains are heavily unionized and have the coordination to strike and agree across both supply chains. That was the ridiculous impact this team claims to debate. This debate was about the public sector for a series of reasons. One, the majority are in unions, so they have the largest impact to strike as well. But also, they're within the same country, so you can coordinate those strikes the easiest and the most simply. That explains why this was about that sector. When those strikes fail, it was incredibly negative with that disruption. And the example historically here is very simple. In 1979, during the winter of discontent, the entire energy sector of the UK, coal miners, etc., went on strike. And for 2 months, there were blackouts across the UK, power prices went crazy, people suffered and often died in the cold. But the government just copped it for those 2 months, blame the unions, and once the strike failed because union workers had to go back to work because they ran out of savings, ran out of pay, the government cracks down. Because this is the key problem. Once a solidarity strike fails, you can only do it once. At that point, your options have run out, and that's when unions collapse and get much more. Let's ask a simple question then, which is, will these strikes work? The first thing we explained here, which gets no engagement from side negative, is that it is very easy for large governments or corporations to play the unions off each other within the strike to get them to break. Because each union is still only loyal to their own members primarily, right? They're loyal to their own members. So if a government then offers, or a company offers your truck drivers a really awesome pay deal to stop the strike, you will just stop the strike, you get your deal, you get your benefit, but you abandon the strikes very quickly. There's no analysis from this team why that outweighs the long-term solidarity they tell you that is just so like morally good. But secondly, they depend a lot of their claims about people just caring a lot about these workers and there's just high empathy. The first thing I want to observe here is that if it was true that everyone loved the workers so much and loved teachers and hospitals, why would they need to strike? Like, it was electorally popular and supported. Why do you require strikes to create that empathy? That was incredibly unclear. We explained it's very easy to blame the union and the workers for the strike. One, because the damages caused by them, they're the nurse who chooses not to work. They're the doctor who chooses not to work. Then it's easy to approximate that blame as well. But secondly, governments have just way more control over the media and over the airwaves. This seems like you release one big press release that has the title Solidarity. That is absurd. All the corporate media barraging the unions day to day in newspapers, talking about the government blaming these unions for deaths and putting out stories that they're killing people. That is way more persuasive than just unions being like, I'm Solidarity, I feel very good about myself. Clearly that's not the case. But also they just say, their main claim on this debate then is, okay, companies will fold and they will fold as well. Problems here first of all. First of all, if this team is correct, that Amazon has incredibly low margins and they're competing with Temu, they cannot raise their workers' wages because they lose that profitability, right? Like if this team is right that Amazon is competing with other companies, if that is the case, once one company breaks, the other company has raced to the bottom. Like Temu is not going to change its workers' practices, only Amazon will. So Amazon making a loss into the future on every single product they make in that instance. We explained that companies can just wait it out. They have massive liquidity, they can take out loans and push things in the future as well. But secondly, workers can't strike for very long. Like these workers who are very low paid have almost no savings. They do not have high wages. They just do not have the benefits or savings to strike for a very long period of time. So all Amazon has to do is just cop a bit of profit or loss for 2 or 1.5 weeks, and the workers will come crawling back. But also, as we explained in Kathy's speech, you can just replace these workers in many instances. Maybe not immediately, but if they go on long enough in the strike, you can replace these workers. They're very low skill. Explains why these companies can outlast the strike even if the demands are reasonable. And as I explained before, they cannot actually concede to the higher wages because it loses affordability in the long run. They have to cop the strike and just push it until the workers break. This team, on governments, this team's claim is, governments have incredibly deep pockets, so they will just give in and that's fine. First of all, this is just not true, because first of all, they have to do, once they concede a pay rise to one work group, they have to do it to the other ones. For example, when Chris Minns paid police officers 40% more, that's what caused nurses and doctors to strike to get pay rises as well. That's the key claim. They're like, you can only concede once and that's fine. That misses our argument. If you can give one industry a massive pay rise because of a strike, every industry now knows, if we strike, we'll get a massive pay rise. And that's why governments cannot fold on these strikes. It's not just that one industry having one fair concession, it's every industry now knowing, if we solidarity strike, we will just get the pay rise, we'll get it, and that's a very bad thing. So that's why they cannot concede. But also, I think our weakness mechanism does just stand. And they're like, you look humble, you look, like you're a nice guy. That is not true. If a government who is actually opposed in negotiations these existing policies and just suddenly flips on that, they do look weak and terrible, right? Like this debate only occurs when the government had opposed that pay rise and benefit and flips on that pay rise and benefit where they conceded these strikes. That is an embarrassing moment for government to do. It looks bad for voters, especially if the voters voted for them because they were anti-union and were a conservative government. That's especially bad in that case. That's why governments cannot fold, will not fold. What is the harm then of these strikes not working? And this is crucial, because as I said before, solidarity strikes, you only get one shot. And unlike what Tom tells you, things can get worse for unions right now. You can do more union busting. You can make conditions much worse. So if unions solidarity strike and it fails, there are a series of harms that go unresponded to. First of all, there's a long-term collapse in the mandate for unions to negotiate on pay deals. Because once the government wears a solidarity strike, it doesn't have to do anything for you anymore, right? Like, you've lost that fight. They can privatize the workforce, they can crack down, they can lower wages. But at that point, you've lost all your capital. Your one silver bullet has collapsed. But secondly, it means the public in the long term is also more oppositional unions. You are now, to blame for all that disruption we explained down the bench, and so now you are the one who can never get fully covered in the future. But thirdly, importantly, the workers in that union suffered for nothing. So about workers who are low-paying Amazon workers going for no pay for weeks and weeks and weeks, suffering for their own families, for the dream of these benefits. If this strike fails, all that suffering was just in vain and should be weighed heavily into this debate. These workers just suffer, but also strikes are hard. They cause you guilt, cause you stress. You get attacked in the media all the time, get abused for that strike. Explains why that suffering is also in vain and does not work. But finally, we do think in these cases it is just very disruptive. This does look like, hospital shortages and no surgeries being made. It looks like teachers not being in school to teach students. This is very disruptive. But even if it is just the private sector and Amazon, that's also a bad thing. It's bad for efficiency in the economy. It causes slow economic growth and collapses in GDP. If it's across countries and industries, that hurts vulnerable people who are more vulnerable than the very wealthy workers in these cases, public sector who are striking. All those reasons both sides negative.